Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us this evening for the fourth week of the Rugby Research and Injury Prevention Group 2025 Journal Club. We will begin our first Journal Club presentation. Our first intern is Ritvik Panaganti from Georgia Institute of Technology. Ritvik will be presenting on the Rugby Europe Injury Surveillance Report. Ritvik, when you are ready, may you please share your screen?
Hello, everyone. Today's presentation that I'll be doing is on the 2021 and 2022 Rugby Europe Injury Surveillance Report, including the competitions of the Super Cup, under 20, and under 18 Championship. This is from the International Journal of Environmental Research and Public Health from 2023 by Cruz Ferreira and other authors. So a little bit of a background. So rugby union is a globally expanding sport with approximately 10 million players and counting. And as we know, rugby has one of the highest injury rates among team sports due to its contact-heavy nature. And in 2021, Rugby Europe launched the Super Cup and resumed under 20 and under 18 tournaments post-COVID. So please keep in mind, this is important. Under 20 is a senior competition that grants the winner access to the World Rugby Trophy, which includes the top 20 teams in the world, which is basically like the World Cup equivalent. So the under 20 will cause higher levels of competition and higher stakes in this tournament. And there's been limited injury surveillance data for European youth and semi-professional competitions. So some study objectives are to determine the injury incidence rates across three Rugby Europe competitions, as I mentioned in the previous slide, to identify types, causes, and severity of injuries in these tournaments, and to benchmark Rugby Europe data against international injury rates, inform injury prevention, concussion management, and scheduling decisions, and lastly, evaluate risks unique to tournament structure and age grade differences. So this study design is a prospective cohort study using standardized injury surveillance protocols. And the three competitions it examines are the Super Cup, which is semi-professional, 8 teams, 26 matches, and spans almost 8 months. And then there's also the U20 Championship, which has 8 countries, 12 matches, and a 1 week playoff format, so significantly condensed. And the U18 Championship as well, 8 countries, 12 matches, and same 1 week playoff format. And the inclusion criteria is for injuries is time loss injuries only. So basically, if they miss more than 24 hours, 24 hours of missed activity. And the different data types collected are injury type, location, severity, which consists of days lost, activity at injury, field position, and contact type. And the reporting tool is online injury forms submitted by team medics, and analysis consists of incidents calculated per 1,000 player match hours. So here are some of like the results that we had in a table format. So first is injury incidence and severity. So as you can see that there's the three competitions here with the format and the total exposure in hours and the injuries reported here. And this is the injury incidence rate, which is basically the amount of injuries per 1,000 player match hours. And then severity, which is how many days they missed due to an injury. So some takeaways are the U20 had the highest injury rate despite being a youth competition, which in its much higher. It's almost double. It's more than double these. The Super Cup and the U18 Championship. But the Super Cup had greater average recovery time, as you can see with the highest number about amount of severity, which is the more days it took to recover. This is possibly due to more severe and managed injuries. So some injury types and locations. So the most common injury types were sprains and ligament injuries, consisted of 25 to 35% of the injuries. And then second was concussions, which were 10 to 25.6%. And the body parts affected, not a surprise, it was lower limb, which was the most common, around 44 to 52%. And then also head and neck, which were higher in the Super Cup at like 32.6%, and then the U18 at 28.6%. And then also the concussion prevalence in the Super Cup is 25.6%. U20 was 10%, U18 was 21.4%. And this suggests a need for concussion surveillance even at the youth level. So some injury mechanisms. Contact injuries were 84 to 90% of all injuries. And the main events that caused the injuries were tackle, which includes tackling and being tackled, which consisted of 58 to 69% of the contact injuries. Ruck and maul were 2 to 13%, and open game collisions were 3 to 16%. And player position at time of injury, comparing forward to back, was roughly equal across all levels. And once again, tackles remain the dominant injury mechanism, and this is consistent with global data and all the articles we have read in the past. So this also analyzes the timing and field zones of these injuries. So the most injuries occurred in the final 20 minutes of each half. So this indicates that fatigue may be a contributing factor, and this is something that we've talked about in the other journal clubs and is pretty consistent among international data as well. And field zones majority occurred between the midfield and the attacking 22-meter zone. And the tournament format definitely had an impact. Like U20 had condensed scheduling, basically like 3 matches in a week and an increased risk. But the Super Cup was over a longer period of time, so it had more recovery time between matches. So this definitely suggests match load and intensity may influence injury rates. So some takeaways. Injury burden is high even in youth and semi-pro competitions. Tackle technique and contact mitigation remain essential focus areas, and concussion rates are similar to elite levels. Protocols like recognize and remove appear effective. So basically, recognize and remove is when there's professionals on the sideline and they see a player take a hit or hit the ground and they notice some symptoms that could indicate a concussion, even if it's like it could end up not being concussion, but to be safe, they pull the player out, evaluate them. This also allows the team to substitute a player in, so it's beneficial to both sides. And the U20 format, which is short rest, and basically it's a all or nothing format. So if you lose even one match, you would be eliminated from the tournament, and this removes you from a chance of winning the trophy for that tournament, which would put you in the World Rugby tournament. And this may exacerbate injury risk. And so a recommendation would be to review age-grade tournament structure and implement broader injury prevention programs. And these are my references, and I'm open to any questions. Thank you.
Hey, Rithvik. This is Philip, Tessic, University of Michigan. I thought that it was really interesting, especially when they included the descriptive statistics for the upper and lower extremity injuries. I was wondering if they specified, yeah, exactly that slide. They specified for the athletes that sustained those lower limb injuries, if the method of injury was tackling or being tackled, as we saw in a previous paper, because that was also included later on where they mentioned that that was a large factor in all the injuries. But I was wondering if they mentioned that specifically when it came to the injuries of the lower limb or the upper extremities in the head and neck region.
Yeah, that's a good question. So I know from reading like previous articles and other ones, it was the person that was being tackled that had more lower limb injuries. But pertaining exactly to this article, I don't remember specifically whether they discussed that. But I know from reading previous articles I've read, it was the person that was being tackled that had more risk of gaining a lower limb injury. Because I mean, if you think about the mechanism of being tackled, like the person that's tackling leads in with their shoulder and like their upper body, and they're taught to target the lower limbs of the person that is being tackled.
Yeah, I think that definitely makes sense, and that's what we saw in the previous article. And I just wanted to kind of ask that sort of to point out why that's like very important in the data collection process and what we try to do here. I thought that was a really good presentation demonstrating all the evidence and the collection involved.
Hey, Rick, great presentation. You mentioned in your discussion that injury burden was still high among your athletes. Do you think you can go back to the slide where you have all the statistics displayed? Yes, that one. So you did mention burden, but it was a little unclear, at least to me, whether they recorded burden in their study, which is incidence times mean severity. Do you know if there's any measurements regarding that, or if they did take burden into account with the study?
Yeah, so in when I was reading it, I didn't see like exact measures of burden. They looked at each one like separately in each column. So that's not something that they claimed in their article that they analyzed burden and they didn't use burden in their discussion or their key takeaways.
Very good
Okay,
point, Asha.
thank you.
Everyone understands the burden calculation, right? So you have your incidence, but then you have to multiply it by the days absent. So they didn't calculate burden, but they have the variables for you to calculate it.
Are there any more questions? Thank you, Rivik, for the amazing presentation. Our second intern is Dr. Lucy Dawson, who is a recent graduate of Howard University College of Medicine. Dr. Dawson will be presenting on the incidence, costs, and burden of concussion in women's rugby league and rugby union. Dr. Dawson, when you are ready, may you please share your screen?
Good evening, everyone. As Nadira said, I'm Dr. Lucy Dawson, and my presentation today is on an article titled The Incidence, Cost, and Burden of Concussion, Women's Rugby League and Rugby Union, a Systematic Review and Pooled Analysis. This study is by Doug A. King et al. And was published in the Journal of Sports Medicine in 2022. Okay. So some background. I know we mostly do research in rugby union, but there are some key differences between rugby league and rugby union. Most notably, In rugby league, each team has 13 players on the field at a time. There are no lineouts, no rucks, and no mauls. In comparison, rugby union, as we know, is played with 15 or seven players. Some more background, there's an increasing female involvement in in rugby, rugby union and rugby league, but there's still a large disparity in research, unfortunately. This paper reported that there were 7 papers on women's injuries versus 113 for men. So it's quite a big difference, even though there are more and more women playing rugby. There's also growing evidence that following sports-related concussions, women experience greater symptom severity and longer recovery. But because there aren't as many studies for women, that's not really clear. The authors of this article propose it's perhaps based on increased reporting in women versus men, lower neck strength in women compared to men, and sex differences in white matter in the brain. The objective of this study is to provide estimates for rugby league and rugby union concussion epidemiology for women. And their long-term goal is to hopefully understand these differences between concussions in men and women that can help us tailor and improve prevention, care, and recovery for female athletes. So this was a pooled analysis, which means that they combined data from multiple studies to increase sample size. And I know we've talked in our statistical lecture series about how increased sample size increases the power and the strength of your analysis. So that's the goal here. Some of their inclusion criteria include the studies have to be peer reviewed, they have to be prospective cohort studies, they have to report match or training time exposure, and the reported concussions have to say whether it was a result of match or training. Some of the exclusion criteria that they used were they wouldn't use a study if it was unavailable in English, or if they combined the male and female sex match or training exposures. If it was no case studies were included in this pooled analysis, and they also didn't include any meta-analyses or systemic reviews. So getting into the results, they only were only able to find 16 studies that met their inclusion criteria. 9 of them reported on rugby union 15s, sorry. 4 were for rugby union 7s, and then 2 were for rugby league. They were all considered to be of, quote, moderate quality, and they used the strengthening the reporting of observational studies and epidemiology statement, or STROBE statement, to come to this conclusion of moderate quality. So getting into the results, for 15s, for rugby union 15s, the pooled concussion injury incidence was 2.8 per 1,000 match hours, and you can see the confidence interval there. They did find that amateur athletes had a higher incidence compared to World Cup, national, and collegiate levels. And the t-tests for all of these analyses had a p-value of less than 0.005. For rugby union 7s, the pooled concussion incidence was 8.9 out of 1,000 match hours, or per 1,000 match hours. And they saw that elite levels had a higher incidence of concussion than amateur, and with a p-value of 0.0038. And this is pretty similar to what Dr. Lopez reported in his study in 2016 that found concussion incidence of 8.1 per 1,000 match hours. And then for rugby league, they found that the concussion
For women, correct,
for women,
Dr.
yes,
Dawson?
yes, sorry, for women 7 specifically. And then for rugby league, the pooled incidence for concussion was 10.3. However, I would like to note, I mean, I know we talked about confidence intervals, I think last week, that the confidence interval for the rugby league data is pretty wide compared to a much narrower confidence interval for 15s and 7s. So I think this data isn't as strong for rugby league. I don't think that they had as big of a sample size compared to the 15s and 7s. Only 4 of the 16 studies used reported the results reported on the position of the player that suffered a concussion. And so with this data, the authors of this study didn't find any significant difference in the incidence between backs and forwards for the pooled total, World Cup or rugby 7s. They did, however, find that the elite rugby 7s forwards had they were significantly more likely to get concussions than the World Cup forwards and the amateur rugby 7s players. And the last thing that they reported on was the injury burden. So only 5 of the 16 studies reported the burden of the injury burden. And here this table shows the injury burden in cost. They classified concussions as moderate to severe injury claims, I think for like medical coding purposes. and they used a mean cost of 9,804 New Zealand dollars per claim. And moderate to severe under their definition means that it required additional financial support for treatment, loss of earnings, and related medical costs. Injury burden in terms of time lost, the pooled mean was 33.2 days, which was significantly longer than the 7 to 10 day time frame outlined in the concussion in sport consensus. And they also, it was similar to previous studies where the majority of players took 28 days to recover. And then in relation to the concussion in sports consensus, the authors suggest that this might indicate that this consensus might need some updating if players are taking much longer than this 7 to 10 day time frame. They also discussed cause of injury. As RRIPG was saying, most of the injuries that they saw in this study were as a result of a tackle. However, this number is quite lower than some of the other numbers I've seen. I think I saw another one report that it was 88% of concussions come from the tackle. However, this is a pooled analysis, so it has a larger sample size. And then they reported that 7.3% of concussions occurred in head-to-head collisions and 5.1 occurred in head-to-knee collisions. So talking about some limitations of this study, injury definition was a major limitation that the authors talked about that I agree with. Injury definition remains kind of contentious and it changes from study to study, and it can really limit the inter-study comparability when you're looking at multiple studies and trying to combine them. And some studies like only reported injuries that resulted in mistraining or missed matches, and that they posited that would result in underreporting because there could be injuries where somebody seeks medical attention but doesn't necessarily miss a training or a match. And under this definition of an injury, those wouldn't be recorded or counted as injuries. Also, using a mismatch definition for injuries is dependent on the time between matches. And they suggest or pose that the use of a consensus for data collection in rugby union studies should be considered to make things more standardized. Some other limitations, they said that most of the studies were undertaken in a single season or a single competition or tournament, and this could limit identification of trends over time, and that there's a need for more longitudinal studies in the future. And the last limitation is that the studies that they use range from 1999 to 2021. And a lot has changed in this period regarding definitions of injuries and concussions, recognition and medical management of concussions as well. So that's something to keep in mind. These are my references. And if anyone has any questions, I can try to answer.
Thank you, Lucy, for that fantastic presentation. Do you know, first of all, if they were able to, I guess, have measurements of whether most concussions were loss of consciousness or without loss of consciousness? And if so, do you think it could be a limitation if they didn't include this in their holistic study?
That was not one of the things that was included, and I would say it's a limitation. I think that's probably a result of, like I said, like the lack of consistency and standardization across all of these studies, because that I think is good data to get and to see how that impacts, how long it takes someone to return to play and things like that.
Yeah, because as the years have gone by, there have been, I guess, various changes when it comes to identifying how a concussion is made, especially concussion care on the field. So I would expect that to, I guess, change over time. Thank you.
Are there any other questions?
So I think it's always hard when they don't calculate. I think even Dr. Brown from South Africa, Jimmy Brown, calculated his costs of injuries in US dollars. When you calculate in New Zealand dollars or you use the values of whatever their currency is, it's kind of challenging. Not only that, but in these systems are socialized care. So it's difficult to really compare apples to apples, what the costs are overall. They may be throwing numbers out there, which may be, according to their culture and according to their governance, but it doesn't provide a true value of what the costs are, when you measure it to the US dollar of what it really is going to cost to kind of get this care taken care of.
Right.
So again, there's some limitations there as well in putting out those numbers. I'm sure that's what they encountered, but I don't think gives us any insight on how it's going to cost the average person, in the United States or globally.
Right. That's true.
All right. Again, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Dawson. Our third intern is Mina Ko from Lydene Academy. Mina will be presenting on the economic burden of time loss injuries to youth players participating in week-long rugby union tournaments. Mina, when you are ready, can you please share your screen?
Hi, everyone, and thank you for being here today. I'll be talking about the economic impact of time loss injuries to youth rugby players, specifically during week-long rugby union tournaments. This is based on a study by Brown and colleagues from 2015, and their research gives us important insight into the financial strain these injuries will place on both families and the healthcare system. So, an introduction, rugby union is a sport that's loved by many young athletes for not only its energy but also intensity. But unlike any contact sport, there's a real risk of injury. Time loss injuries, which are injuries that keep players from training or competing, don't just affect performance and development. They also can come with financial costs that can affect the families and the broader community. The main goal of the study was to understand the financial burden linked to the time loss injuries in youth rugby. The researchers looked at both direct costs like medical bills and indirect ones, such as parents missing work to care for their injured children. To gather this data, the researchers followed youth players during national rugby tournaments in South Africa in 2011 and 2012. Injuries were tracked throughout the events, and after the tournaments, the players' guardians were interviewed to collect information on medical care and related costs. All expenses were calculated from health insurance perspective to provide a conservative estimate. Out of 3,652 players, 421 were injured, and 71 of those needed medical treatment after the tournament. On average, treating an injured player costs around $731. That's in USD too. Fractures were the most expensive injury type, and interestingly, players with medical insurance actually had higher costs than those without. Fracture topped the list in terms of treatment cost, and the study also pointed out that different position and age groups were more prone to certain injuries, which affects the overall financial impact. Recognizing these trends can help us to develop a more focused injury prevention strategies. And in short, time loss injuries during youth rugby tournaments can create a serious financial burden. This highlights the importance of injury prevention programs and policies to protect both young athletes and reduce these costs. And based on what the study found, the researchers recommended putting comprehensive injury prevention strategies in place. So this includes educating players on safe techniques, ensuring that they use proper equipment, and sticking to safety protocols. They also stressed the need for more research to explore the long-term economic effects and whether prevention effects are working or not. This is my reference, and thank you.
Are there any questions?
Yeah, I'd actually like to raise a question. So in the study, interestingly, they mentioned that the players who had insurance had higher costs than those that did not. Do they provide like a potential rationale for why that may have been, or did they just mention that without like a speculation behind it?
There wasn't any speculation mentioned, but I guess I can speculate, or I'm not very sure myself, but I guess I can speculate that they were able to raise money outside or from getting outside help from either family members or such.
Yeah, so that the reason why I ask is as you kind of mentioned in your presentation, it seems like a bit like an interesting thing that they found. So I was just wondering. But great presentation.
Are there any other questions? Or Dr. Lopez, do you want to add anything?
Yes, man. Thanks so much. And like I said, I'm glad you brought up the point about the financials. Again, they did this obviously with, the Amsterdam IOC Center with Dr. Van Mechelen, Verhagen, and then obviously some of the top people in South African rugby. So, the paper's going to be, done quite well. The issue is that, like I said, it's hard to try to envision whether or not we'd encounter the same costs of what they would encounter overseas in a socialized system. The question comes down is, there are many factors in finding out these costs. I'm glad that they did do something very unique. They did actually ask about the financial impact for parents. But the problem comes down, obviously, there's a standard of living. There's a very big difference between the United States and South Africa. So that's a big financial challenge to really measure comparatively. And like I said, it's just difficult to really kind of calculate that. So just like I said, when you look at these cost papers, make sure you look at them in that aspect. How are they looking at it, what's the tournament that they're looking at, how they're collecting the data. Okay, guys? Thank you. Good job, Emina. Very good.
Thank you for your presentation. And that will conclude week 4 of the Rugby Research and Injury Prevention Group Journal Club. Thank you all for attending.